Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome on board. I always wanted to say that. I'm happy to do it now. My name is Eva Schmidt. I'm head of the culture department at the Goethe-Institut in London. I'll be some sort of host tonight. I won't talk long, so no worries about that. I know we have a special guest. I would just like to inform you about the running order of tonight's event. We'll have an introduction by our director at the Goethe-Institut London, Angela Kaya, who's sitting up front here, and she'll hand over to our honored guest, Christopher Clark, of course, who'll do the Brady Lecture. And afterwards, after about 45, 50 minutes that the lecture will take, we'll have a Q&A with your questions, the questions from the audience for Christopher Clark, for about half an hour, 20 minutes, half an hour. And then you can join us back in the so-called gun room, there's no pun intended, for a drink or two on behalf of that occasion, the Brady Lecture, and indeed the commemoration of World War I 100 years. So welcome again tonight, and I hand over to Angela Kaya, our director. Welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Distinguished guests, Professor Clark, Martin Brady, as director of the Goethe-Institut London, it's a great pleasure to welcome you on board. I have to repeat this, to welcome you aboard the HMS President tonight. I am absolutely delighted that we be celebrating tonight's Brady Lecture together with all of you. This year for us is, this event for us is the core event in a very exciting but also very challenging year. As we are all aware, 2014 marks not only many important historical events. The year has also made it very clear how strong the German-Anglo ties have been over centuries, and indeed still are. A couple of weeks ago, I think nearly 3 weeks ago, on the 9th of November, both Britain and Germany marked two very deeply moving and profound events. In Britain, it was Remembrance Sunday, which commemorates all the servicemen and women who have given their life in and since the Great War. In Germany, it was the celebration of the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. The next day, The Guardian newspaper described it as follows. Two peoples paused to remember the two events which between them marked the beginning and the end of the short, bloody 20th century. It was only a whim of the diary that made these two dates converge, but the link was always there. As a consequence of the devastating atrocities of the Nazi regime and the Second World War, the newly established German government decided to found the Goethe-Institut. That was in 1951. A national cultural institute operating independently. The overall goal was to encourage, to regain trust, and to encourage international collaboration and exchange on the basis of mutual understanding and shared values, and finally to foster intercultural dialogue. And until now, I think these are the main principles upon which the Goethe-Institut is based. The reforging of the relationship between Britain and Germany was aided greatly by individuals who sought to encourage and nurture that mutual understanding and dialogue, and to then communicate it to a public at large. One such individual was Philip Brady, and to whom this annual lecture is dedicated, and whose son, I'm happy to say, is with us tonight. Philip Brady, a teacher of German studies, a very well-known broadcaster, lecturer and writer, was an important partner of the Goethe-Institut London in earlier years. His knowledge of German culture and history was remarkably outstanding, and his enthusiasm and wonderful gift of communication, broadcasting almost every month on the BBC German and World Service, made his role for the Goethe-Institut most valuable. So tonight's lecture will celebrate Philip Brady's contribution to the Anglo-German exchange. Our speaker this evening has in recent years had a remarkable influence on the discourse surrounding German history and Germany's ever-changing role in Europe. We could not have hoped for a better person to hold this lecture tonight. A professor of modern European history and a fellow of St. Catherine's College in Cambridge, Professor Christopher Clark is indeed a most distinguished expert on Prussia and the history of Germany in the 19th and the early 20th centuries. The Sleepwalkers, his best-selling book on the outbreak of the First World War, has been, as we all know, has been the subject of much debate in Britain and in Germany. And I'm delighted that Professor Clark has been able to come here tonight and to talk to us on that very topic, and hopefully to encourage further debate. We will see. Lastly, only a few words about this ship. HMS President, one of the last remaining First World War era ships, has been transformed recently by German artist Tobias Rehberger. The contemporary Dassel ship design harks back to the fascinating Dassel style used on over 2,000 ships, including HMS President, during the First World War. But in terms of symbolism, I think this outstanding ship is the best venue for tonight. Originally built for military and defense purposes in 1918, it now serves as a venue for cultural events and academic conferences, for example. And it represents somehow the historical developments and strides we have made in the last 100 years. And that's great. But now, ladies and gentlemen, let me hand over to our speaker, and please join me in welcoming Professor Christopher Clark. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to begin by thanking Angela Kaya, the director of the Goethe-Institut London, for those very eloquent and generous words of introduction. And of course, I'd also like to thank the Goethe-Institut itself, a wonderful institution, not only on account of its extraordinary cultural significance, its cultural history as part of the German Bundesrepublik virtually since the end of the Second World War, but also the place where I learned German in a little town called Schwäbisch Hall, where I remember my adventurous journeys through the world of German Modalverben, a world full of treacherous pitfalls, through which they navigated us with great skill and aplomb. I was hoping as I came on aboard tonight, I've never spoken on a ship before. Actually, that's not true. I have once, but it was in very different circumstances. I was hoping, certainly it wasn't a naval ship or a warship, I was hoping to have the opportunity to say the words, "Permission to come aboard, sir," in the manner of Sean Connery, but unfortunately that opportunity didn't arise. You may feel during this lecture the ground moving beneath your feet. That is not the mesmerizing power of my words. That is simply the quiet motion of the Thames. But in any case, okay, so now to the images. I want to start with a couple of images because I think it's always good to revisit the events of the 28th of June 1914. They're familiar in their outlines to everybody in this room, I'm sure, but they have a kind of a sort of density about them which rewards revisiting. There's something about them which just stays interesting no matter how often you visit them. This is a couple who on the morning of the 28th of June 1914 are about to have a very bad day, I think it's fair to say. He is Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and she is Sophie Chotek, his wife, the descendant of a very distinguished lineage of Czech nobility, of Bohemian nobility, not distinguished enough for the Habsburg royal family, who did not regard her as of adequate standing or genealogy to qualify as a member of the Austro-Hungarian royalty, for which reason she was never allowed, for example, to sit in the royal carriage with its golden wheels beside her husband. This is one reason why on the 28th of June in Sarajevo, in the rather sort of far-flung, marginal, sort of peripheral capital city of Bosnia-Herzegovina, she insisted on sitting beside her husband. That was one reason. The other reason was that the 28th of June 1914 happened also to be their wedding anniversary, and she was determined not to be separated from him on that day. Of course, the 28th of June was also an important date for another reason. It was a red-letter day in the calendar of Serbian national memory because it recalled the date in 1389 of the Battle of Kosovo Polje, of the Field of Blackbirds, a date on which a great Serbian army, in fact it was rather more mixed than that, but in myth it was remembered as a Serbian army which was destroyed, broken up by Ottoman forces, signaling or heralding the end of the empire of Tsar Dusan, the Serbian sort of Balkan empire of the High and later Middle Ages. So that's the couple. Here's a picture of Franz Ferdinand waving and greeting people near Sarajevo railway station shortly after his arrival. There I merely wanted to draw your attention to these sort of lustrous feathers that you can see on their helmets. They are green ostrich feathers. Now, you just have to take my word for it. I know that it's a black and white picture, but I assure you they were green. I'll come back to them in a moment. This is a map of the Balkans, which I've included simply because I think one can never look too often at the map of the Balkans. When you know, it's always a rewarding exercise, and there's always something there that one thought one knew but didn't. There are always surprises, and I've included two maps here. They're quite similar to each other but not identical. They're like those two pictures on the back of a cereal packet, which are almost the same, but you've got to identify 10 differences and then mail it off for a small and useless prize. And what you see in this case are some important differences, the most important being simply the withdrawal of Ottoman power. The Ottomans are in helter-skelter retreat across the peninsula between 1911, which is the date of the first map, and 1914. That's one point. And as you can see, a lot of other things are changing too. With an inaudible sort of plop, Albania suddenly appears in 1913. An Albanian nation-state is invented and created under international tutelage in London, in fact, in this city. Montenegro changes its shape, so does Greece, so does Bulgaria. Serbia in particular, you can see, greatly enlarges its extent between 1911 and 1914. And these transformations, this complete transformation of the geopolitics of the Balkans is the consequence of two wars, the two Balkan wars of 1912 and 1913, today largely forgotten, but very bloody and brutal wars which extracted a very high toll in blood and treasure. But it's also worth pondering just very briefly on something that these two pictures have in common, something that remains the same, in other words, and that's the location of Belgrade. I know the printing here isn't very good, so it looks as if Belgrade is inside Austria-Hungary, which it's not. But Belgrade is virtually on the border. I mean, it's a few minutes' drive by horse and carriage from the city of Belgrade to the border, the then border with Austria-Hungary. And that gives you a sense of the intimacy of this rather toxic relationship between the sprawling multi-ethnic Commonwealth of Austria-Hungary and the Kingdom of Serbia, its neighboring state. A relationship which, of course, was deteriorating fast during the years between 1903 and 1914 when the shots were fired in Sarajevo. Now, this is as close as the early 20th century got to Google Earth. It's actually an engraving from the Baedeker travel guide, and I've included it really just because it really wonderfully sort of sums up the structure of Sarajevo. And Sarajevans will tell you, they always use this metaphor, that the city is like a pair of cupped hands, and that between the cupped hands runs a river, the river Miljacka, a very handsome, fast-flowing river. On either side, the city rises fairly fast towards these sort of low mountain or hill peaks. It's a very, very beautiful city, and it was along the quay bordering the Miljacka River, the Apel Quay, that the cars proceeded eastwards across the city towards the city hall there, Rathaus. You can see it's a German map. Okay, now I just like this image because it conveys with such brutal simplicity the narrative of the events of that day. Obviously, the visit is coming seriously unstuck by the time this happens. This is as the cavalcade, the motorcade passes the Chumuria Bridge. A young man by the name of Nedelko Chabrinovich, one of 7 young men who have gathered in the city to carry out this assassination. He throws a bomb. It's actually something more like a grenade. He cracks the detonator cap off by striking it against a lamppost, which itself makes a loud bang because it's a chemical fuse. And hearing this bang, the driver of the second car, which has Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Sophie Chotek in it, instinctively presses on the accelerator, thinking that a gunshot has been fired, and that is probably the reason why the bomb didn't land in the car and blow up, in which case it would have killed them both, but rolled behind the car and blew up instead under the third car, destroying the car, or at least writing it off effectively, and injuring everybody inside with metal pieces. I mean, nobody was actually seriously injured, but there was a lot of blood around, a lot of superficial wounds, and people had to be carried off to the hospital to be stitched up, and so on. Now, at this point, you might have thought it might have been a wise idea to call off the visit to Sarajevo. And in fact, this idea was proposed to Franz Ferdinand. It was thought, this is not going well, let's leave. But Franz Ferdinand wasn't listening. He said, absolutely not, the man is clearly insane. Have him taken to an asylum, business as usual, carry on with his visit as planned. Now, he did this because he was an extremely irritable man. He was suffering from something for which the technical term is grumpy old man. It's something that happens to many of us as we get older. We get more and more irritated by less and less. And after all, having a bomb thrown at your car is not a small thing. He above all didn't want to be bossed around by the security people. He was having none of that. He said, "I'll go and take a look at them in hospital afterwards. In the meanwhile, we'll carry on as things were planned." In the meanwhile, Nedelko Chabrinovich had leapt into the Milyatska River, hoping to be swept away by the flood, but there was no flood because it had been a very dry summer. So he stood up to his thighs in water, which was as deep as the river was, and tried to take the poison which he'd brought with him. I'll come back to that in a moment. Whereupon he was captured by a policeman, and a figure I think you can only find in the sort of fin de siècle world of the Habsburg Empire, namely a barber armed with a pistol. That's how he's described in the Austrian court transcripts. I've included this image because it shows the couple, a certain amount of meeting and greeting went on, and when they arrived at the City Hall, this picture is taken in front of the City Hall, they were greeted, as you can, they're leaving in this particular picture, but they were greeted by this group of men, and what's striking about them is they're virtually all wearing fezzes, and this is a reminder of the fact that Sarajevo was a Muslim town. It was one of the major centers of European Islam, and the city sort of the machinery of the city administration was entirely in Bosnian Muslim hands. The mayor was a Muslim, and in fact he was a man called Mehmet Čurčić. To him fell the unenviable task of welcoming the couple on their arrival, and he didn't like giving speeches at the best of times. He'd had a text prepared for himself, which he had virtually learned by heart. He'd had it sort of glued onto a little paddle of wood. He was holding in a trembling hand, and then a loud bang was heard from the other end of the street, and it was reported to him, a bomb has gone off, and so on, but they're still coming, you still have to give your speech, but there's been a bomb. So he was now even more nervous, but of course his speech was now totally inadequate to the situation, because it began with the words, "It is with sentiments of the deepest joy that the citizens of Sarajevo welcome your highnesses to this beautiful city." Halfway through this anodyne opening, he was interrupted by Mr. Grumpy, who said, "Deepest joy, welcome, is this how you express your welcome to visitors, by throwing bombs?" At which point she was seen to whisper something to him. We don't know exactly what she said, but history doesn't reveal, but we can assume it was something along the lines of, "Let him be, dear, it's not his fault," whereupon he sort of grunted, "Very well, you may continue." Moments like this occur in every marriage. So, in any case, here they are. It's all over now. They've been meeting and greeting. They've pressed the flesh, and she's met with some local Muslim ladies, wives of dignitaries. He's chatted with the local worthies, and they've gone up to the balcony and looked out over the city. And now they're leaving to get into the car. And of course, what happens next, you all know. There's a fanciful image from the French journal Le Petit Journal, whose images are used all over history books because they're just so brilliant. They're wonderful color lithographs. unfortunately, this doesn't really conform very closely to what actually happened. It's all the wrong way round. He actually was firing from the other side of the car, from the inside of the turn into Franz Josef Street, not from the outside. And they didn't rise up out of their positions so that we can see them nicely like that, like figures from an opera singing, "I die." This did not actually happen. They stayed exactly, well, there's more where that came from. If you clap, that's a risk. But in any case, so they remained seated exactly where they had been before because the shots were so effective that she was immediately unconscious. And as the car pulled away, it wasn't clear to Count Harrach, whom we can see sort of racing into the scene. He had been standing on the running board, though in Austrian fashion he was standing on the wrong running board on the side, which wasn't very helpful. And so he ran round. We can see him running round there. But the point is that they remained so motionless that it wasn't clear to him that they'd actually been struck. He didn't leave his position, by the way, as we see doing there. He remained holding on to the Archduke to keep him upright because he could see he was shaky. Meanwhile, she had teetered sideways. The car was now reversing and turning and onto the Appel Quay where it was supposed to have gone in the first place. It wasn't supposed to have taken this turn. And it drives down the Appel Quay, and as it drives down, he sees blood issuing from the Archduke's mouth, and he hears him speaking to Sophie, who by this point is probably comatose, if not already dead, and he's saying to her, "Sophal, Sophal, stirb mir nicht, bleib am Leben für unsere Kinder," right? Sophie, Sophie, don't die, stay alive for our children, which was a very typical thing for him to say. The two of them had a very tender marriage and a very intense and warm family life by the standards of dynastic marriages and family life at that time. And of course these words became viral, and you didn't use that term then, but they became famous right across the Habsburg monarchy. Within 24 hours they are cited at length and discussed at length in all the major newspapers. There's a sort of wave of emotion generated by the media. This emotion is not about the fact that Franz Ferdinand had been deeply popular or loved. It's not like JFK. I mean, people don't fall to their knees weeping at the thought that he's dead. He wasn't a popular character, as I've already described his rather grumpy and unlikable public persona. The point is that the narrative of how he died, and in particular these words, and then all the private details of his life, which are divulged to the media within the 24, 48 hours after the assassinations, transforms his standing in the public eye, and he becomes this magnet for public emotion. Karl Kraus put it very well when he said, "That which remained silent in the Archduke's life became eloquent through his death." And that's something, of course, that's not the last time that the death of a public person will generate massive waves of partly media-generated emotion. The fact that they're generated by the media doesn't make them any less authentic. And so we move now to this picture here, which is often captioned as the arrest of Gavrilo Princip. Now, if this were in fact the arrest of Gavrilo Princip, that would be an extraordinary thing, given the state of photographic technology in 1914. If someone had happened to be standing by with a camera to get this snapshot of a completely unforeseen event. In fact, it's nothing of the kind. It's the photograph of the arrest of another man called Fedor Beer a day or two after the arrest at the events of the 28th of June. And of course, the photographer had been given he'd been, what's the word for it? He'd been tip-off. He'd been given a tip-off by the police so he could position himself in the right place and get this shot. But once he'd taken this shot, he had a brilliant idea. And that idea was to caption it as the arrest of the assassin. And under that caption, it was syndicated worldwide, and he made a tidy fortune out of this picture. That was, of course, the last time a journalist has ever behaved like that. But even if this picture is not telling us much about what the arrest of Princip actually looked like, it is telling us something anyway, because what we can see is that this young man, Fedor Beer, who's in fact a German, suspected of involvement in the plot, although he was later released, is not just being arrested, he's also being protected against angry locals from the city. And they're all Muslims. They're angry locals wearing fezzes because the Muslim population of Sarajevo was Habsburg loyal. There was strong Habsburg patriotism in the Muslim population because they felt they had been protected from the fate which had met Muslim societies in other parts of the Balkans. In the Christian Balkan states, Muslims had not fared so well. So there were a lot of them were Habsburg loyalists, and in both the case of Čabrinović and of Princip, those two young men as well had to be protected against angry members of the crowd. So the story is telling us something, if not quite what it claims to be telling us. Then here is just an image of Gavrilo Princip. Interesting to look at his physical appearance, because he was very fragile. young man. He was also very ill by the time he carried out this act. He was probably suffering, well, he was certainly suffering already quite seriously from tuberculosis, of which he subsequently died in the Theresienstadt fortress. One of the kind of curious twists in this story is the fact that he winds up in Theresienstadt, one of the theaters of the later Holocaust, of course. But even stranger is the fact that the interrogating judge who sees Princip and questions him about his motivations and his acts and so on over the next few days in Sarajevo itself, Leop Pfeffer, also perished in Theresienstadt as an older man because he was Jewish. So that's one of the many kind of twists, strange twists in this story. There's a picture of some of the other conspirators, Čubrilović, Čabrinovich, Ilyich, and Trifko Grabej, and there is a picture of the man who helped to plan this in the background, or at least who provided them with the means whose organization provided them with the means that they required to carry out the assassination. The man, well, his proper name is Dragutin Dmitrievich, but he's known to history as Apis, the chief of Serbian military intelligence. A man who was there, of course, posed, is performing in this picture in a sort of predictably and characteristically conspiratorial pose. He was a deeply conspiratorial man. He ran the association, or the underground organization known as Black Hand, or its proper name was Ujedinjenje ili Smrt, Union or Death, and it was a sort of, irredentist group dedicated to the creation of an expanded Serbian fatherland by any means necessary, including violence and assassination. One last important point. When these young men were arrested, and very quickly most of them, one of them got away more or less for good, but most of them were captured within a few days of the crime, it quickly became clear through the interrogations and analysis of what was found in the apartments of the young men and apartments of the friends where they'd been staying and so on, that they had been supplied in Serbia but with guns and with bombs, that they had been they were in possession of Serbian irredentist literature, but one thing was never proven because it was not the case, and that is that the Serbian state was implicated in this assassination. It was not. The Serbian Prime Minister Nikola Pasic and his cabinet deplored the activities of Apis, whose underground organization they rightly saw as an absolutely lethal threat to Serbian security. And Pasic would have, if he'd felt powerful enough, had felt able to, he would have interdicted Apis's activities. He had prior knowledge of the passage across the border of these young men and of bombs and weapons and other equipment in suitcases. That's all quite clearly proven through the Serbian sources, but he did not believe he had the means to shut Apis and his activities down. So this is not about the Serbian state carrying out assassinations or planning them. It's about a runaway rogue element within that state, which is running a sort of irredentist operation at tremendous risk to Belgrade and to the Kingdom of Serbia. Okay, so that's really as much as I wanted to say in the way of revisiting the events of the 28th of June. And I wanted really to continue just by reminding you of something that you all know already, which is that on the morning of the 28th of June, when those two people came to Sarajevo at the end of the Bosnian summer maneuvers, Europe was, of course, still at peace. And if on that morning you had asked the statesmen of Europe, you'd gone around or sent people around with, to interview the statesmen of Europe and to ask them how likely they thought it was that a continental war, a war continental in scope, a European conflict was imminent, then they would all have told you that a great war, a large war of this kind, had been becoming less likely, not more likely, in recent years. After all, Europe had managed to get through the two Balkan wars, two very bloody, rather cataclysmic conflicts on the Balkan Peninsula, without there being a larger conflict. And we have the eloquent testimony of Arthur Nicholson, a senior functionary in the British Foreign Office, permanent undersecretary, who said who said in a letter to a colleague in May 1914, he said, "In all the years that I have been at the Foreign Office, I have never seen such calm international waters." This is in May 1914. And yet, of course, 37 days after the visit and after the assassination on that morning, Europe was indeed at war. And out of this European war, there unfolded a world war. a war which I think has rightly been described as the primal catastrophe. The words are originally George F. Kennan's. This term is metastasized across the German literature, die Urkatastrophe. It's now being questioned. It's slightly controversial. It's become rather tired, among other things, simply from being repeated and repeated. It's become a bit hackneyed. But and of course, it is true that the war is not a primal catastrophe for everyone. It's not for the Poles, for example. For Poland, the First World War is a painful rebirth of the Polish nation state. For the Australians, I think it would be melodramatic to describe this war as a primal catastrophe. It's a foundational act. It's the first major free political decision of the new Australian nation state, which is only confederated in 1901. Until then, Australia had been a sort of a collection of colonies ruled independently, ruled separately from Westminster. Only in 1901 does it become something resembling a modern nation state, and the first great free political act of this independent state is the decision to enter the war. And Australians are never drafted. There is no conscription in Australia. Every Australian who fights in the First World War is a volunteer. And that's a very important part of how Australians remember that war. So it's not a catastrophe for Australia, but a sort of moment of foundation. Nevertheless, if you look at the poison released by this war into the international system, then it seems to me justified to think of it as a primal catastrophe. This war consumed 4 major empires: the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, and the Russian Empire. More importantly, it consumed the lives of at least 10 million young men on its numerous battlefields. It accounted for between 15 and 21 million wounded, and I'm not referring here to lightly wounded men who've never been counted, but to seriously wounded men, many of whom carried the effects of these wounds right through to the end of their lives. And certainly people of my age from Australia, and it's no different in Britain or in Germany, will remember from their early childhoods grandfathers, elderly great-uncles, elderly friends of the family who had been through this war and were still carrying with them either the trauma or the physical effects. My own great-uncle Jim still had pieces of German shrapnel floating around inside his left leg, and I remember my mother explaining to me that these pieces of shrapnel were actually mobile. They were constantly moving around, and every now and then one would painfully expose itself at the level of the skin. And so I remember one Christmas staring at Uncle Jim's leg in the hope that a piece of shrapnel would pop out, until my mother told me not to. And so I think that the German Jewish emigre American historian Fritz Stern is right when he refers to this war as the disaster from which all the disasters of the 20th century sprang. The rise of Italian fascism is difficult to account for without this war. The October Revolution in the Russian Empire, impossible to imagine without this war. The February Revolution is something everyone had predicted, a takeover of power by a group of Duma political interests from the Russian parliament, a collapse of Tsarist autocracy. Everybody had predicted something like the scenario of February 1917, but nobody had predicted the Bolshevik coup, the creation thereafter of a one-party state of a kind that had never been seen in world history, and of course no one could even have imagined the Stalinist aftermath, and I think it's very difficult to imagine the particular trajectory that German history takes after 1918 without the titanic stresses of this war, the rise of National Socialism, the unleashing of a war of extermination, the Holocaust. So I think that my former Cambridge colleague, now teaching at Yale, I think he's about to move to Columbia, Adam Tooze, is right when he speaks in his new book, The Deluge, about the aftermath of 1914 to 18, is right, I think, when he refers to this war as having unhinged the global system and having unleashed immense amounts of toxin, which the system is still working its way through, particularly in the Middle East. It really was a cataclysm of secular dimensions, of dimensions which fill a century. It disfigured the 20th century before it was 20 years old. So the question of how this war came about, it follows from all of this that this question possesses a certain intrinsic interest. And I don't want to disappoint you this evening, but I'm not the first person to have noticed that this is an interesting question. The debate is not a new one. It's very old. In fact, it's as old as the war itself. In fact, it's even slightly older than the war, because the argument over who was responsible for bringing this war into the world began before the first shots were fired. And it's astonishing how many of the arguments one finds in the secondary literature, including the really most sophisticated ones, it's astonishing how many of them one finds on the lips of the statesmen who brought this war into the world. In 1991, the American historian John Langdon published a book called The Long Debate with Oxford University Press. That's the only time I'm going to mention Oxford this evening. A book called The Long Debate, whose title is also, in a sense, the thesis of the book. And one of the comments he makes in that book is that he thinks there are about 25,000 books and articles in English which one really needs to read in order to master this complex problem. He wasn't referring to the literature as a whole, but to the things one really ought to read. When the British writer and novelist Rebecca West went to Sarajevo in 1937 to do the research for her wonderful book, Black Lamb, Grey Falcon, which some people in this room may know, an extraordinary book, a kind of mixture of travel log, personal recollections, diary entries, a kind of ethnography of the Balkans, whose people she knew very well and also loved very much. And a lot of historical reflection on the place of the Balkans in Europe's 20th century. When she went to Sarajevo to explore some of, that place, among others, the places where the war broke out, she went with her husband, Paul, or more precisely with one of her husbands, he was just one of several, to the balcony at the front of the city hall in Sarajevo, and they looked out over the city, and she turned to him and she said, "There's one thing I'll never understand." She said, "I'll never understand how this all came to pass. It's not that we know too little, it's that we know too much." And that was in 1937, and today, of course, we know a great deal more. So from that it follows that, any attempt to write a new book about this is likely to be greeted with skepticism. And in fact, as I sat working away on this book, I was asked by many of my colleagues in Cambridge, why the hell are you working on this subject? I mean, it's been done to death. It's been absolutely, you're not going to find out anything new. I mean, look at it. And that's one of the wonderful things about one's colleagues. Just as one's struggling with the cruelties of a really tough topic, they come up with excellent reasons why one should just curl up and die. Well, one has to find an answer to these taunts, and the answer I found was that of course, yes, the debate is old. It's an old debate, but the subject at the root of this debate is still fresh. In fact, in many ways, the subject of 1914 is fresher today than it was 20, 30, or 40 years ago. When I first encountered this problem, as all Australian school children do, because it's one of the central themes in Australian secondary history education, when I encountered it as a high school, a schoolboy in high school at Sydney Grammar School in the 1970s, a lot of period charm had accumulated around the events of 1914. This was Europe's last summer. There was a lot of tennis and gin and tonic. And if you read the books of Barbara Tuchman, The Proud Tower and The Guns of August, wonderful books which I recommend to everyone with lots of really sophisticated historical thinking in them. But if you read these books, that you found a lot of detail about uniforms, about gala menus for big dinners, about Habsburg court etiquette, the bizarre rules according to which certain royal babies had to be presented in a certain order in their perambulators at court occasions, the rules about who was allowed to sit next to whom, and of course among the lists of those who were not allowed to sit next to each other was Sophie Chotek and her husband, the heir to the throne, Franz Ferdinand. And as you read all this lovingly rendered description of uniforms, Lord Salisbury making his way to the the House of Commons in London on a tricycle which he had put together himself. He'd built it himself. It was London's first pneumatically tired tricycle, pushed by his valet James. It had to be pushed because it had no pedals. As he said, push, James, and James would let go, and then his coattails would be sort of flapping like this. And as you sort of acquainted yourself with what David Cannadine has called the ornamentalism of this world, the assumption stealthily asserted itself that if these people had gaudy green ostrich feathers on their helmets, then perhaps they had gaudy green ostrich feathers on their dreams and thoughts as well. Perhaps they were, people of another era, a bygone era, an era that was perhaps condemned to die, people who no longer speak to us in a way that we can understand. But it seems to me that if you cast a fresh eye on the events of 1914 from our perspective, not from the perspective of the 1970s, but from the perspective of people in the not anymore quite beginning 21st century, then you can't help but be struck by the raw modernity of the events of 1914. It starts, after all, not with prancing horses and carriages, but with a cavalcade of automobiles. And if you run through in your mind the events on the Appel Quay on the 28th of June, you can't help but have flickering at the back of your head those films of Dallas in November 1963. It starts with a squad of suicide bombers, and that in a very literal sense, because these young men are not just carrying guns and pistols, they're carrying phials of potassium cyanide. And they've been instructed to take their own lives after carrying out their mission. And in fact, the two most active commandos of the group, Gavrilo Princip and Nedjeljko Chabrinovic, both try to take their own lives. They both try to take their poison. The poison had gone off, it had decomposed, and so all it did was to burn the stomach lining, make them very ill, but it didn't kill them. But nevertheless, they tried. They seriously intended to give their own lives. They were suicide bombers in a very literal sense. And behind them, of course, were underground networks that cultivated a sort of, the cultivate doesn't really matter, but, oh, there we are, that cultivated a kind of cult of assassination, death, revenge. When I first encountered all these details of the story, it seemed to me part of a very remote past, shut off from the present. But in all kinds of, these features of that story have remind us now of aspects of our contemporary political scenery which are all too familiar. And our compass has shifted in other ways as well. If you think, for example, of the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, they reminded us, it seemed to me, of the sort of energy and violent potential of nationalism on the Balkan Peninsula. And this is important because in many accounts of the outbreak of the First World War, the Balkans are as good as invisible. They're virtually airbrushed from the scene. They simply aren't there. And so integrating them into the story, it seems to me, is something that makes more sense, or that's to say, leaving them out makes less sense after the wars of the 1990s. And then there's the fact that 9/11, the attack on the Twin Towers, reminded us of the power of an event, of a terrorist event. I don't want to make a kind of cheap comparison between the mass carnage of 9/11 and the murder of 2 people on a street in Sarajevo, but what I have in mind is the idea of the event. The event as an analytical category has sometimes been out of favor with historians. And there was a time in the 70s when virtually every historian felt obliged to cite the beautifully formulated words of Fernand Braudel, the great exponent of the École des Annales in France, who famously said, that events are the sort of contemptible, lukewarm foam that swims on the great waves of structural history, right? And a historian worth his or her salt will naturally want to deal with the great structures of the longue durée and not waste their time on the pathetic wet foam. But of course, the reality is that events can be hard and structures can be quite soft. So the relationship is more dialectical and more reversible than perhaps Braudel was willing to give it credit for, although Braudel's own reasons, he had his own very good reasons for this for seeking refuge in the history of the longue durée. And finally, there's the fact that we no longer inhabit this era of bipolar stability that we used to call the Cold War, or actually we still call it the Cold War. We've exited from that era. I went to a very interesting paper in Belgrade by the American political scientist George Friedman, who distinguished between the post-Cold War, the period from 1989 until about 2006, which he described as unipolar. There's really only one great power left standing. Everybody's fixated on Washington. Phrases like full spectrum dominance are being widely used. You don't hear that anymore. Then he says comes 2006-07, the financial crisis, all kinds of other things go amok, and since then we're in the post-Cold War. It's not very elegant, but the point that Friedman makes is that we've re-entered an era of authentic multipolarity, and a world in which we have on the one hand rising powers. We have a weary titan, as we did in 1914, a world power hegemon which is wearying of its global role. We have rising powers challenging the traditional pecking order, and I'm not actually thinking here particularly of Russia. And so in other words, we're in a world much more like the world of 1914, and that's one reason why I think the predicaments of that year speak to us more urgently now than they did in the 1970s or 80s. And these shifts in perspective prompt us as historians to rethink the story of how war came to Europe. Accepting that challenge does not mean, and I really want to emphasize this, it doesn't mean embracing a kind of vulgar presentism, where you just remake the past to meet the preferences or the political needs of the present. because to do that would be simply to generate propaganda. Rather, it means acknowledging those features of the past of which our changed vantage point can afford us a clearer view. It does not mean simply sweeping aside all that's been understood and recognized in the literature on the First World War. There's a great deal there. It's one of the great literatures in the history of historical writing. It's an extraordinary literature. And one thing that is not important or good to do is simply under the auspices of a one-sided revisionism to push all that aside and say the new gospel of World War I has arrived. But it is important, I think, to integrate into this complex picture the new insights to which we have a better access. We're intellectually freer to think about them than we perhaps were in the 1970s and 80s. Okay, so bearing all of this in mind, how does one go about refreshing the narrative, a narrative which is in some ways so familiar? How do you develop a distinctive angle on a question like this one? And I just wanted to dwell briefly on how I tried to do that and before I close. The first thing was that I think what historians often do is they think how they're aware of a sort of powerful thesis in history, and they think, how can I find a different answer? Now, the problem with looking for a different answer is that really, in a sense, you shouldn't be looking for the answer first. You should be thinking about the question and not knowing what the answer is until you've actually answered it. So I thought, in order to get around this problem, I thought, why not try asking a different question? In other words, rather than ask the question, why did this war happen, which is the question at the heart of the literature on the outbreak of the First World War, rather than asking why not try asking how? How did peace become war? Now, of course, why questions and how questions are intertwined at the root, a bit like Cathy and Heathcliff. You can't completely separate them. But on the other hand, they lead us in different directions. Why questions pull us in the direction of large categorical causes. So when we ask why, in the end we're going to start thinking about imperialism, nationalism, the rise of social Darwinism as a way of thinking about international relations in a competitive rather than collaborative way, arms races, and so on. And as we trawl the decades before 1914 for causes, a kind of optical illusion establishes itself. There are more and more causes. We pile them all onto the scale. And as we do that, the scale starts to tilt from a possible war to a probable war to an inevitable war. There's just so much causal pressure that this war has to happen. But of course, a war is not an erupting volcano. It is not a natural event. It's a political event that has to be chosen. This illusion of causal pressure is precisely that. It's an illusion which we create by creating these things called causes and piling them up on top of each other. What that does is to squeeze out of the field of vision the agency, the freedom of choice of those individuals who chose this war, who made decisions that brought this war, that helped to bring this war about, that made it possible or probable, or even, once the war is actually occurring, inevitable, irreversible. And this is important, I think, because a lot of the really most interesting writing on this war, and I'm thinking now of the book The Improbable War, edited by Holger Afflerbach and David Stevenson, makes the case that this war was in many ways getting less likely before it became more likely. There isn't a steady linear accumulation of causation, as it were. It's much more complex than that. The second reason for moving away from why towards how has to do with a comment that a Bulgarian historian of the Balkan Wars makes in the preface to his book, where he says, once we pose the question why, these are his words, guilt becomes the focal point. Guilt soon becomes the focal point. In other words, when we ask why, what we often really mean is who. Who did this terrible thing? Where are the villains who brought this war into the world? A blame-based approach obliges us to draw up a charge sheet, either to exonerate or to impugn a particular state. And that indeed was the modus operandi pursued by Fritz Fischer, who didn't simply, when he began his work on the origins of the First World War, he didn't simply ask himself which of the great powers contributed in which way to this war. Let's look at them all, spend an equal amount of time in all the archives and try and come up with an answer. He only looked at the German archives because Fischer already knew where the responsibility lay. He was interested in following the roots of Nazism Nazism backwards into the period before the First World War, and he never showed any interest in any of the other states. The work he did on Germany is exceptionally textured and extremely interesting, and a lot of the conclusions he came to still stand the scrutiny of historians today. It's not the case that these works have lost their value. They're still very, very valuable works of history, and he's one of the great figures of post-war historiography. Nevertheless, he was, of course, operating in a way that was led by and oriented towards the quest for to identify the a blameworthy state, and he focused only on the German archives. By contrast, our How approach draws a sort of line, a journey, or follows a journey through the events that aims to identify the decisions that brought war about. And these decisions aren't decisions for war. They may not be conscious options for war. They may well be decisions that had other objectives in mind, but that nonetheless created risks, which in turn became pieces of causality, that which, once you had the crisis in Sarajevo, helped to bring this war about. So one of the effects of asking how rather than why is to acknowledge the often rather broken relationship between intentions and outcomes. This does not mean excluding questions of responsibility entirely from the scene. In the end, of course, you have to face them. You have to ask yourself, was this war caused by a particular state? Was it caused by the system, or was it caused by all the participants? And if so, in what sort of measures of respective measures of responsibility? But it involves trying to answer that question, answer the why question, as it were, out of the answers to the how question, rather than the other way around. Fritz Fischer answered the why question first and then set out to find out how the Germans did this terrible thing. But you can do it the other way around, and that seems to me to produce a different sort of mode of approach, very different kind of narrative. So that's the first way in which I tried to, to shake up the story a little bit, to think about it in a new way. The next thing I did is very banal, and it's something that all historians do. I tried to capture trends and impulses from the recent literature and from the older literature. I mean, having this pyramid of paper beside you while you're working, which has been preoccupying some of the best brains in your discipline for the last 100 years, is, it's not a very happy-making state of affairs. And there are moments where one just sort of drops one's pen and wants to give up. But there are all sorts of opportunities when you work in a crowded field, because you can find all kinds of interesting arguments, including arguments which have been largely forgotten or are underexposed, and you can bring them into dialogue, into conversation with newer impulses. So simply by connecting up arguments from within the secondary literature, already you can start to create fresh constellations. And of course, in addition to that, I tried to illuminate aspects of the sequence of events that brought war to Europe, which I felt had been underexposed in the literature. And one of these, one example is the Italian war on Libya in 1911. In 1911, the Italians sort of surprised everybody by mounting a completely unprovoked attack on what we now call Libya. It hasn't been called Libya. It wasn't called Libya then. It's only been called Libya since the 1930s. At that time, it consisted of 3 integral provinces of the Ottoman Empire: Fezzan, Cyrenaica, and Tripolitania. And the Italians launched this attack. It was a very important war. Military historians take great interest in it because it's the first war in which airplanes were used for aerial reconnaissance to signal the position of the enemy to Italian artillery divisions and also to Italian warships, to artillery batteries, and also to Italian warships. It was the first war ever to see aerial bombardments. I mean, the first time there were airstrikes in Libya was 1911, exactly 100 years before the airstrikes of 2011. And it was, but it was also, and historians of this war see in it a crucial milestone on the road towards the formation of a pan-Arab nationalism in northern Africa. On the other hand, it was also a milestone on the way to the Great War, because this attack on 3 integral provinces of the Ottoman Empire flashed a green light to the Balkan states in 1912 and 1913 to launch their assaults on the Ottoman Empire and take whatever they could from the sick man of Europe, as it was. The Ottoman Empire was sometimes known to its detractors. And so, in other words, and there's a very interesting interview between the chief of the Serbian political department of the Serbian foreign ministry, a man called Miroslav Spalajkovic, who gave an interview after the First World War to a French journalist. And in that very interesting interview, he says, he identifies the Italian war on Libya as the first cause of the First World War. He says, "Ça c'était la première agression." That was the first aggression, and everything that came thereafter, the two Balkan wars and the Great War itself, all unfolded out of that first aggression. And actually, we can find during the war similar analyses from senior French decision makers as well, people like Stéphane Pichon and others. So what's interesting about that is not simply the fact that Libya has once again in recent months been invoked as a factor in the deepening alienation between, for example, Russia and NATO, Russia and the West. 100 years after this Italian war on Libya. In other words, it doesn't just remind us of the importance of Libya, though I think Libya is important, but it also, it seems to me, is interesting because it lies completely outside what my old friend at the University of North Carolina. And Sam Williamson, I was about to have one of those blanks, senior moments. What my old friend at the University of North Carolina, Sam Williamson, has called the German paradigm. A paradigm focused entirely on Berlin and what the Germans are up to, this German-centered focus. The Italian war on Libya has just nothing to do with that, because it's not the Germans and the Austrians who are telling the Italians to attack Northern Africa. On the contrary, it's the British and the French who are goading the Italians into a war on Libya. This is not about German hegemony on the continent. This is about old school imperialism. I'm not wanting to impart blame. I mean, the imperialist powers behave like imperialist powers, and so they were doing indeed in 1911. Another point which I tried to illuminate, which I thought seemed to me had been perhaps not could use a bit more illumination, were the processes of decision making in the various European executives before 1914, which struck me as, the more I learned about them, as extremely chaotic and unpredictable. You had complex adversarial structures within all of these executives. Think of this one fact alone, which I think gives a good example of what I'm talking about, namely that during the tenure in office of the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, no fewer than 16 French foreign ministers came and went from office, and 2 of them came and went twice, which is quite an achievement. It gives you a sense of the sort of revolving door-like structure of the Quai d'Orsay, or at least not of the Quai d'Orsay itself, but of the ministerial post. And one starts to understand why it was such an unpopular position, and wasn't particularly striven for by the more ambitious figures on the Paris political scene, because once you're in that post, you found you're the subject of a kind of guerrilla war from your own functionaries. The functionaries of the Quai d'Orsay were constantly leaking documents against their own ministers. The ambassadors were impossible to discipline. I mean, my favorite example is Paul Cambon, the French ambassador in London, who famously wrote to a colleague, "When I disagree with the instructions I get from Paris, I just burn them." It was easy to do that in those days because there were open fireplaces in the offices, and there were no fire alarms. Although I had a conversation with the marvelous French ambassador he's now left, but he was in Berlin, Monsieur Gounod-Montagne, and he said to me, "Well, today it's the same." In any case, that's just France. But I mean, if you look at Russia as well, if you ask the question, this is the question every other chancellery was asking of its diplomats in St. Petersburg, who actually runs the show? Who is making policy? The answer was always different. In 1904, in January 1904, it was the Tsar. Then comes the Japanese War, total debacle. The Tsar disappears from decision making. Then it's Stolypin, the man who runs the Council of Ministers. But then in 1908, during the Bosnian annexation crisis, it's the foreign minister. He seems to have taken over. He's making deals with the Tsar behind the backs of his colleagues. And so the location of power is constantly shifting. And indeed, one could speak of a kind of Heisenbergian uncertainty about the precise location of power in these complex structures. And this opacity, this unpredictability in the system, structurally determined, greatly increased the crisis proneness of the European international system. And the question arises whether we can even speak of a policy. We have this wonderful term in English, policy. There isn't really a German translation for it, but you know, we talk about a Balkan policy, by which we imagine that, you know, a state has an idea about what it wants to do about a particular thing, the Balkans, for example. But really, the closer, as you look more closely, you see that there is no such thing as a Russian Balkan policy. In 1912 and 1913, there are numerous Balkan policies being recommended to various different officials by various different people. There's a chorus of often dissident voices. And that struck me as a very important part of the sort of instability and mobility of the system, the volatility of the system as we approach the outbreak of war in 1914. One final point before I close has to do with the changing character of the Franco-Russian alliance. The Franco-Russian alliance begins from the end of 1911 onwards, 1912-13, to become more aggressive in its character. Raymond Poincaré begins to assure the Russians that in the event that there is a kind of quarrel of some kind on the Balkans, a quarrel, for example, between Serbia and Austria-Hungary, it doesn't really matter who starts this quarrel, but if there is a quarrel and the Russians feel obliged to intervene under the pressure of their public opinion or for geopolitical reasons, then the French will stand by Russia's side, even if Russia herself is not under attack and no one is mobilizing against her, so she's also not under threat. And this is important because it casts a new, it gives the alliance a new temperament. Up until the end of 1911, the French had warned the Russians again and again never to indulge in Balkan adventures. They'd always said, France does not recognize in the Balkans a vital interest of Russia's, let alone of France. And the Russians had paid the French back in good coin during the Agadir crisis over Morocco in 1911. They say to the French, deliberately using exactly the same language, they say Russia does not see in Morocco a vital interest for France, let alone for Russia. So the effect of this alliance is actually an effect that mutes risks. It's a tethering alliance by which both the partners tend to pull each other back from the abyss, as it were, from taking risks in their respective spheres of interest. But that all changes during 1912, when Raymond Poincaré begins to assure the Russians that in the event that some kind of quarrel breaks out in the Balkans, the French will stand by Russia if Russia decides to intervene. So those are aspects of the story that to which I tried to give a little bit more weight. None of this means that we should overlook the bellicism, the bellicosity, the paranoia, the aggressiveness of Germany's military and civilian leaders. There's no question that all of that psychogram that Fritz Fischer drew of the German elites, you know, the inside of the heads of the German elites, it's a very unflattering picture. It's a largely true picture, and it's quite disturbing. None of that means that we should sort of simply push aside that image of bellicosity and paranoia that Fritz Fischer so painstakingly drew, and of course a great deal more has been added into the detail of that picture by the members of the Fischer School, by his disciples, by his supporters, and by his historiographical allies. But the aggressiveness, the provocativeness of German foreign policy has to be set in the larger European picture. It simply does not make sense to view it in isolation as the sole sort of primary cause, as the first mover of these events. It is not the case that this war was brought about by the extraordinarily and remarkably provocative actions of one state that stood apart from the others because it was playing a different game. The Germans were playing the same game as the other great powers on the European continent. And that's the tragedy of Europe in 1914, was that you had a plurality of great powers which were all willing to risk a major conflagration in order to pursue their own interests. Once you walk the paths of the how question rather than the why one, it becomes very difficult to return to the simplicities of the unipolarities of the Fischer thesis in its various lighter, modified versions in the more recent past. There's no question about the appeal of what's sometimes called the blame game. It gives pleasure to parcel out blame. There's no question. It's an enjoyable activity. We all enjoy doing it. Oddly enough, none of us enjoys being blamed. It's a very one-sided pleasure. but we all enjoy handing it out. But the problem with the blame game is not that you might end up blaming the wrong party, because in a sense it doesn't really matter anymore. It's not a political, a make or break or a do or die political issue of the kind that it was in the era of the Versailles Treaty, the interwar period, and so on, when the World War was replaced by the World War of documents. And German historians, nationally minded German historians, tried to prove bizarrely Germany's complete innocence in the events that brought war in 1914. The danger isn't that we might end up blaming the wrong party. Sean McMeekin blames the Russians, Fritz Fischer blamed, and his people at school blame the Germans. Neil Ferguson has even been perverse enough to blame the British. Brilliantly and perversely blame the British. But none of that, it doesn't really matter which party we blame. The problem is that if you pursue the question in that way, allow your investigation to be oriented around this kind of moral, these moral objectives, then you end up building into the analysis all kinds of assumptions that may have no place in it. For example, the assumption that in every interaction between conflicting parties, one must be in the right and the other must be in the wrong. I mean, was it wrong of the Serbs to seek the acquisition of a larger fatherland for themselves? I mean, they wanted nothing that the Italians and the Germans hadn't already achieved in the 19th century, namely the creation of a nation-state, if necessary, by military violence. Was it wrong of the Austrians to insist on the creation of an independent Albanian state, which the Serbs, of course, viewed as a rampart between them and the Adriatic? This is a policy that they greet with derision and rage. Was one of these policies wrong or more wrong than the other? The question is ridiculous. It goes completely at cross purposes with the nature of the problem, which is that we're dealing with a conflict of interest. So I'll close here and simply say that the story of how this war came about was not and is not a James Bond movie script, in which at the end of the story we'll find velvet-jacketed villains stroking a white cat with a steel prosthetic hand and plotting world Armageddon from some kind of mountain hideaway. It's not an Agatha Christie novel, at the end of which we'll find the vicar with a blood-stained swordfish standing over the prone corpse of Lady Carrington in the conservatory. It was an intensely interactive, an intense and an extremely complex crisis. It was the fruit of the actions of a gallery of political actors who shared a fundamentally similar and fundamentally European political culture. And it was to illuminate those aspects of the crisis of 1914 that I wrote this book. Thank you very much.
Dear Christopher Clark, thank you so much for this impressive, actually colorful and brilliant insight into your work, the combination out of overview and insight, basically what it is. Being German and working for a German cultural organization, there are at least two German characteristics I have. I am pro-European and I try to be on time. So referring to the latter, we have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions from the audience. Please keep it brief so we can have as many audience members as possible to ask questions to Christopher Clark. And referring to the first, I'll take myself the privilege to ask the first question. Pro-European for me means having grown up as such, as being part of the EU and seeing Germany as somehow an integration state or nation that's working towards integration within Europe, within the European Union. And your book or your work made me realize that that's probably come out of World War I and World War II as well, as the opposite, a counterbalance to what has happened before, being in the middle of Europe, being surrounded by other stations, other nations, and having tried to be rather aggressive and fend off or defend itself through aggressiveness, through military action, and then turning it around towards probably a very strong sense of integration. Am I right in that?
Yes, you are. No, I think that one of the central concerns of this book was precisely to think about this problem as a European problem. In other words, to think about the events of 1914 on a European scale, and to try and restore the European dimension of the history of this war. I mean, there have been wonderful studies of individual states. That's been the dominant paradigm. There have also been very good bilateral studies, like Paul Kennedy's, beautiful book on the Anglo-German antagonism. So there have been lots of studies of that kind, looking at particular relationships. But I wanted to try and think about how the continental system as a whole is implicated in this dreadful conflict.
Thank you. We have 2 roving mics. One of them is the one I'm holding here, so I'll pass it on to my colleagues. There's a question up here and one in the back, so we'll start with you. Please wait until you get the mics and then ask your question.
Thank you very much indeed. My question's quite simply, could you ever envisage that Austria-Hungary might have survived and evolved into some form of, for want of a better expression, Southeastern European Union?
Well, whether it would have evolved into a European Union or not is difficult to say. But I mean, this is one of the sort of $60,000 questions: is how moribund or not was the Austro-Hungarian monarchy? And one of the interesting things is that a lot of the people who later become the most eloquent exponents of its deathliness, its kind of its morbidity, were before 1914. Actually saying quite the opposite. So if you look at Wickham Steed, who becomes one of the great articulators of the British, the second sick man, the sick man on the Danube argument during the war. I mean, he generates a lot of anti-Austrian propaganda during the war. He helps the official British war propaganda effort in that respect. But he writes a book in 1913 as he leaves Vienna to return to become the editor of the Times. He writes a book then in which he says, yes, there are crises in Austria-Hungary. They're happening all the time. That's true. In the parliaments and diets, there are people arguing about language law and what language you should speak in elementary schools in Slovenia and all this kind of thing, and how many Czechs should be in the postal service and all that kind of thing. They're constantly arguing about that. But he says what's often called, as oddly enough, it was called the racial contest, or the racial controversy, or the national contest. These are crises of growth, not crises of deterioration, crises of as a Untergang, what's the word for that? Crises of downfall. They're crises of growth, because the fight is about a greater share in the spoils of an expanding system, which is fundamentally healthy and bringing a lot of goods, which people are over the shares of which people are competing. Now, you could obviously push that argument too far. There is a lot of dysfunctionality. The Austro-Hungary becomes, by 1913-14, it's in a state of more or less constant political crisis, and one gets a sense that not only have the Austrians learned to live with crisis, they've lost the art of living without crisis. They somehow need crises to keep on going. And that's the real meaning, I think, of Karl Kraus's observation that, he said there's a great difference between Berlin and Vienna. In Berlin, the situation is always desperate, is always serious but not desperate. In Vienna, it's always desperate but not serious. So, and what one needs to do, I think, if one wants to understand the sort of vitality of this system, is to look below the level of representative politics, which is very tumultuous, at the functioning of the administration, which is really quite remarkable. Look at all these cities, which of the old Habsburg Empire, which are great success stories, really quite extraordinary, very humanely run, humanely administered spaces for humans to flourish in. And they still today are a reminder of the extraordinary achievement of this empire. So, it's like a Rubik's Cube, this question. It just goes on and on. You can see all the weaknesses, but you can see many strengths. And many of those who hated the empire at that time, especially Hungarians, later deeply regretted having contributed to its disappearance. I think the virtual history question about the European Union, I'll leave that to Neil Ferguson, who's written very eloquently about that. It's hard to imagine it ever becoming quite like today's European Union. Though it must be said, interestingly enough, Franz Ferdinand had plans to completely restructure the monarchy and to turn it into something a bit like the United States. In fact, his idea was to rename it the United States of Greater Austria, make it much less democratic than the United States, with a much more powerful federal government, but with ethnically more or less homogeneous federal districts, 16 in all, which might have given this empire a new lease of life.
Thank you for your talk. Going back to the death of Queen Victoria, surely that's what started the build-up to the First World War. The differences between her progeny, Tsar Nicholas II and the Kaiser, built up during that period before the First World War, especially militarily and navally. Admiral Fisher and his opposite number trying to meet the trying to maintain the balance of power with the dreadnoughts, etc. And other events which led up to it. Was there an inevitability that the slow demise of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian Empire would result in the First World War? And if the assassination hadn't taken place, do you think the First World War would have ever happened?
Well, okay, that's actually several each individually very interesting questions. Just to start with the death of Queen Victoria, I mean, you reminded me there very much of a comment that William II, that the German Kaiser Wilhelm II, makes in a marginal comment. He says, he writes at the very end of the July crisis, he said, if Grandma was still alive, he means Queen Victoria, if Grandma was still alive, she would never have let Georgie and Nicky gang up on me like this. And sometimes I've been asked, how could they go to war, even though they were all related? And I think anyone who asks this question has clearly never had Christmas with a large family. I think that the question you ask about whether Europe could have weathered the demise of the Ottoman Empire or its retreat, the retreat of the Ottoman Empire was always going to pose challenges because it creates, I mean, vacuums are not good in politics. Weak areas where questions of political sovereignty and territorial control and geopolitical dominance have not been resolved are bad because inevitably there's going to be more than one bidder to fill the vacuum, and we've seen that more recently in the peripheral areas of the old Soviet Union, which have, with astonishing regularity, have all produced crises which are analogical in some ways to the crises that have popped up in the Balkans after the weakening of the Ottomans. I think that another more serious problem was it's not just the retreat of the Ottomans; it's also the declining belief of the other great powers in an Austrian future. That's a more serious thing. When the Pentarchy, if you go back into the sort of mid-19th century, it was an absolute axiom that you needed to have Austria-Hungary. I mean, in those days it was called the Austrian Empire. Whatever you thought of how it was governed or of the people who were governing it, it was a logical necessity because it was just one of the ordering principles in the southeast. It was crucial to the stability of Europe. But by the years after 1900, more and more one finds, in particular in London, but especially in Paris and St. Petersburg, people speaking very lightly of the imminent demise of Austria-Hungary. And when you start saying that a great power, a state which is still in formal terms a member of the great power club, when you start denying it a future, then in effect you also deny it rights in the present. A state with no future has no present. And that was a very dangerous development. And I think that compounded the difficulties produced by the gradual weakening of Ottoman power in southeastern Europe. And as for the last question, what would have happened if there hadn't been an assassination? Well, that's an important question. I mean, people often say the assassination, the July crisis doesn't matter because war was coming anyway. Well, that's not true. I mean, if there hadn't been an assassination, the first thing we know would have happened, this is not virtual history because it's all there in the documents. Franz Ferdinand planned, once he returned from the Bosnian maneuvers back to Vienna, one of the first things he was going to do was to sack his very bellicose and aggressive Chief of General Staff, Konrad von Hötzendorf. And had he done that, one of the loudest voices for a policy of provocation on the Balkans would have been removed from the scene, and the most powerful voice for peace, namely that of Franz Ferdinand himself, would have remained in place. So it's very hard to see. I mean, they talked about, dealing with Serbia during the Bosnian annexation crisis when the Serbs mobilized and started talking about a war to the death and so on. And at that point, Franz Ferdinand had said, absolutely not, I don't want a single Serbian plum tree. I don't want anything from the Serbs. We'll leave them alone. It's not worth the candle. And he would have continued to make those kinds of arguments, there's no question. And probably also to have been supported in those arguments by the elderly reigning emperor, whom he, of course, as we know, a biological necessity would soon have replaced. So I can very easily imagine Europe getting away, surviving the summer of 1914 without a major conflagration.
given the nuance and the humanity of your history, well, how do you feel about the fact that the British government at the moment seems desperate to frame a more noble narrative for World War I, to pitch it as a glorious struggle against a clear aggressor? We have even Michael Gove saying things like, we were fighting for democracy. And even the BBC, our lovely BBC, chose for its 3 landmark documentary series about the start of the World War I, historians like Ferguson, Paxman,
Max Hastings.
And Hastings, of course, and Strawn.
My old friend Max Hastings.
How do you feel? I mean, because your view seems, as I say, so nuanced, so humane, and yet the trend at the moment is so against that.
That's true. Well, you know, one just has to keep on working away. And Max Weber called it, you know, the drilling of hard boards. You just have to keep on drilling that through that hardwood and just try and keep on making a noise until finally somebody listens. And obviously you have, and I'm very thankful to you. So just by all means, do keep on saying that to everybody you meet on the street corners and everywhere. I mean, I do think that it's true. There was a sort of wave of jingoism, which is quite extraordinary because it stands out even in the European context. I mean, there's been none of this in Germany, as you can imagine, where the German government kind of crept around in late 1913, hoping that no one would notice there was an anniversary. The French prepared, you know, massively, as one would expect, because for them it is a great national trauma. But the whole logic of their commemorations is utterly unnational. It's eminently Europeanizable. It's about loss and trauma and suffering, you know, and there's nothing chauvinist about it whatsoever. Only in Britain was there this kind of reawakening of a discourse which seemed to have its roots in the war itself. You know, the idea that, you know, admixed, of course, with a sort of bad history, I mean, badly understood history. So you had people writing, I'm not going to name the person in question because he's a colleague, but a very well-meaning colleague writing that the Germans were virtually Nazis in 1914. And I went to another talk, which another colleague gave. I won't name him either, actually, for juridical reasons, and he's rather aggressive. But anyway, he said, he's a kind of UKIP's historian of, I mean, I'm sure there are many UKIP members here, and I'm not a political person. But anyway, the point is that he stood up there and said, you know, the Germans weren't quite Nazis in 1914, but they were almost there, right? Which is, I mean, that's sort of teleology driven to the point of absurdity. So yes, there's been a lot of that, and it is surprising. You know, there is a problem with these immense death tolls, that it is difficult to say, you know, there was no point in it all. And of course there was a point. I mean, I do think that it's wrong to push to the other extreme and say that Britain ought to have stayed out or had no good reason for intervening. I think the reasons that Edward Grey offered to the lower house of Parliament, to the House of Commons, were very powerful reasons. I mean, Belgium was a sort of a moral reason, which had very little to do with the actual decision to intervene. But the argument that he made before the House of Commons, which was that if the Germans win, we'll have a Napoleon on the continent, which is very bad for British interests. If, on the other hand, the French and the Russians win, well, we'll be completely exposed right across our imperial periphery, particularly in northern India, where we have no means of blocking a Russian land army. And, you know, that's not a bad argument for intervention. So, you know, it wasn't meaningless. They went, they died for king and country, for a country that still exists, and their sacrifice imposes on us various obligations, you know, among other things, not to forget what they did and what they gave. So I don't think that their sacrifice is meaningless, but I think that this jingoism is out of place and odd. And what one can do about it, I don't know, just keep on arguing and, you know, trying to make a case for a more nuanced view.
One last, well, let's make it two. Question back there and a bit further up.
How and where will the next European war start, and what can be done to stop it?
Well, if I knew the answer to that question, I probably wouldn't be allowed to be here. I'd probably be in some kind of locked cell in Washington. You know, I think that you know, I wish I knew. My own feeling is, I imagine you possibly are thinking about the current Ukrainian crisis. It is very alarming, and you know, I think there are some analogous features. I think there's been a certain amount of sleepwalking by various parts of the system. I mean, not just on the Russian side either, incidentally. But I don't myself think that we're likely to see a really major conflict over the Ukraine. I certainly hope not. What strikes me about the relationship between Russia and the other powers involved in this controversy is how robust the communicative architecture is. I mean, the Russians are talking to NATO, to the European member state partners on many different levels. It's not just through diplomacy. There's the G9, there's the OSZE, there's there are various other bodies and structures through which they can communicate. And where I think we are more likely to see, where I think we don't have that kind of robust communicative architecture is the West Pacific, where you have hyper-modern states like South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, China, and all in conflict over various different rather complex territorial disputes. Some of these states, of course, have defensive alliances with the United States. I forgot Taiwan, by the way, defensive alliance with the United States. But these are very modern societies anchored in what's effectively an 18th century security architecture. There is no EU, there's no G9, or G8 rather, there's no European Council, there's no, there's no OSZE. It's, there I think it's just a sort of naked collision of national interest. And there I think the risks are perhaps bigger, although at the moment it looks like things are calming down. I think, we mustn't forget the West Pacific as another area where risks are being created.
Professor, I don't wish to be a party pooper, but the
Go ahead.
The use of the words jingoism,
yes,
in relation to the Great War, and the fact that you consider how more important than why puzzles me, because if one thinks of another conflict years later, you could analyze that in terms of the intransigence of Britain and France over the invasion of Poland. You could think about it in terms of the reluctance of the Western European powers to accept Germans' desire for Lebensraum. But actually, that is to miss the point, isn't it?
Sure.
Because surely in the Great War also, we can't just see this as a series of unfortunate events with purely conflicting interests. Is that an entirely valid way of looking at it?
Well, which way in particular? Your way of looking at what I've just said, or I mean, no, I don't.
Well,
think
I'm suggesting your way.
No,
I'm asking you whether your way is valid.
Well, I'm questioning whether your attempt to globalize my How approach from 1914 to 1939. I don't think that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, if you adopted the kind of approach that I have, but failed to notice that Lebensraum was an exterminatory philosophy, destined to doom millions upon millions of Europeans to death in the most horrifying conditions, then you would obviously be. I mean, you'd be a revisionist, a propagandist, you'd be a neo-Nazi. I mean, you'd be a completely crazy figure who would never, one hopes, would never acquire any status within the academic world. So I want to really press this point home because the argument has sometimes been made, he who begins or she who begins with 1914 will soon end with 1939. Well, that's a completely ludicrous claim in my view. So the How approach doesn't mean completely evacuating an evaluation of the kinds of philosophies we're dealing with. I mean, if I found that the Germans had some sort of philosophy of world domination by means of war, which they had turned into policy in 1914, then of course I would have to acknowledge that and say they're playing a different game from everybody else. They're doing something different. But the difficulty is, of course, that the sources don't yield up that evidence. That's the real problem. They show, on the contrary, that the Germans are playing the same kind of game, playing by the same rules as everybody else. It's not good behavior, but it's behavior like the behavior of the other great powers. So I completely reject the notion that this kind of analysis would also result in a relativization of the guilt of the National Socialist Germany for the Second World War. I'm not against the idea of guilt as such. I think that in 1939 we do have a guilty party, because we have a regime which was exterminatory in its objectives and turned that exterminatory philosophy, which was always a violent philosophy of destruction from the very beginning, into one of the most hideous wars of extermination the world has ever seen. So I just don't think that 1914 and 1939 are very similar. I think the problem we have is, when we backdate the kind of moral maelstrom of 1939 to 1914, we end up falsifying the picture. 1914 took place in a very different world from 1939, involved very different kinds of actor.